Sharks don't just hunt in the deep. Whether you're diving, surfing, sightseeing, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, these stories prove the ocean has no boundaries. From glass-bottom boats shattered by sheer force to flooded city streets turned into feeding grounds, these 6 terrifying encounters reveal how close apex predators can get when instinct takes over. This video will dive into 6 real shark attack stories in the most unexpected places. The glass-bottom boat moved slowly over the deep blue water near Gansby, South Africa, drifting lazily above one of Earth's most notorious great white shark feeding zones. It was a warm, windless morning, and the sea was unusually calm. The clear water below revealed the haunting beauty of the ocean floor and the flickers of shadow that moved like ghosts beneath the surface. 6 Russians were among the 12 tourists on board, part of a package tour that promised sightings of massive sharks in their natural environment. Victor, a retired engineer in his late 60s, fond of wildlife photography, stood near the front with his wife Irina, who kept clutching his arm nervously. Nearby, a younger couple, Alexei and Tatiana, both in their early 30s and on their honeymoon, took photos through the scratched glass panels beneath their feet. The boat's crew consisted of 2 local guides and the captain, who had over 20 years of experience navigating these waters. The ship was sleek but light, with reinforced glass flooring that allowed passengers to peer into the sea. It had been inspected, certified, and cleared for shark tours just weeks before. No one expected what would happen next. Just before noon, the sea around the boat changed. The clear water darkened as shadows began to form below the hull. The captain eased the motor down, letting the ship drift naturally. The tourists leaned over the railing or stared down through the glass, eager for their first real look at the sharks. Then came the ripple. A massive shape surged upward from the depths, a pale underbelly followed by a dark back and wide tail. And in a violent flash, a huge great white shark erupted from the water, slamming its full weight into the starboard side of the boat. The impact was thunderous. Glass shattered. People screamed and fell to the deck. Water sprayed over the side and flooded across the cracked panels. One of the tourists, a young Russian named Andrei, lost his footing and slid across the slick surface. His hands clawed at the rail but found only wet fiberglass. A second hit from the shark shook the boat again, and Andrei was flung overboard, disappearing into the churning water. Panic broke loose. Victor tried to pull Irina to her feet as another crack opened along the floor. The boat tilted slightly, taking on water quickly. Some passengers clung to railings or each other, while others scrambled for life jackets. The crew shouted instructions, but they were drowned by fear and the rising sound of chaos. Then came a scream, short, sharp, and cut off too soon, as Alexei slipped through a shattered section of the side rail. He hit the water hard, and within seconds, a trail of red spread around him. The shark, a giant male estimated at over 17 feet, moved with terrible speed. Its jaws closed around Alexei's torso and pulled him under before he could scream again. Blood surged to the surface in a thick cloud. Still on the deck, Tatiana reached for him but was pulled by the sudden motion of the boat. She crashed into a bench and rolled toward the broken edge. Her leg slipped through a jagged gap, and she tried to scream, but her voice cracked with fear. Before anyone could help her, a second shark emerged, smaller but no less lethal. It lunged at her leg, and in an instant she was gone too, yanked over the side with a splash and a trail of blood that turned the sea crimson. The remaining passengers scrambled toward the boat's center, where the damage was least. Water rose rapidly through the floor, gushing up between broken panels. One man, bleeding from a cut to his arm, held tightly to the railing as he watched the water turn thick with red foam and moving shadows. The captain radioed for help, his voice shaking, urging the Coast Guard to hurry. He yelled to his crew to distribute the remaining life jackets. They worked quickly, helping injured passengers cling to debris or intact hull sections. Victor held onto Irina, both soaked and trembling. He watched the blood in the water and the sleek fins slicing through the waves. The sharks circled, as if waiting for the boat to tip further. One of them slammed its head against the hull again, testing its strength. Some tourists tried to use broken seats and benches to patch holes in the flooring, but water kept coming in. The boat wasn't sinking fast but steadily. Its engine was dead, and its radio barely worked. Rescue boats arrived 20 minutes later, alerted by the captain's broken transmission and the GPS distress signal. When they reached the scene, the rescuers found the water stained red and the boat dangerously low in the sea. The surviving tourists were pulled from the deck one by one. Some were crying and others were too shocked to speak. 3 bodies were missing. The sharks had vanished by then, disappearing into the deep just as quickly as they had come. Victor was the last to leave the boat. He clutched a piece of torn cloth soaked in blood. Irina had lost her shoes and part of her sleeve in the chaos, but she survived. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she gripped the side of the rescue boat. In the aftermath, marine officials studied the damaged vessel. They found that although the glass bottom had been rated for wildlife viewing, it had not been designed to withstand full-force breaches by massive sharks. There had been no secondary containment layer, steel mesh or safety railing bolted with ocean-grade fittings. Every flaw had been exposed in seconds. 3 lives were lost. Their bodies were never recovered. The company suspended all glass-bottom tours immediately. Authorities cited design vulnerabilities and inadequate emergency protocols. But in Gansbai, known for its great whites, many locals believed something deeper had gone wrong. The sea had given its warning, and no glass, no matter how clear, could ever protect against a predator built by nature to dominate. Miles had spent years chasing waves and light, traveling from coast to coast with his cameras, drone, and old but reliable jet ski. That morning at Point Reyes, the surf was crisp and glassy under a cold blue sky. A northwest swell had pushed in clean sets that broke beautifully across the reef. Dozens of surfers were out, and Miles, 32, lean and tanned with a quiet, focused demeanor, hovered just outside the break zone, piloting his drone above the lineup. He loved mornings like that, cold but not punishing, the wind low, and the sea alive with motion and light. His drone cast a thin shadow on the water, gliding silently above the glassy surface as he guided it in slow arcs, capturing the surfers carving along the waves. When the ocean exploded behind him, he was in the rhythm, checking the drone screen, glancing at the surfers, adjusting his balance on the jet ski. Without warning, a massive white shark breached the surface just meters away. The water erupted with foam and fury, and the shark rose vertically, twisting slightly in midair. Miles saw it only for a split second, its pale belly and slate-gray back contrasting against the sky, its mouth slightly open, eyes locked onto something. It wasn't going for a surfer. It wasn't going for the ski. It was lunging directly at the drone's shadow, which had just passed over the shallows nearby. The shark's body partially crashed onto the jet ski's back. The impact jolted the craft forward violently. Miles was thrown forward, his chest slamming into the handlebars before the shark's snout slammed into his back, knocking the wind out of him. One of its teeth raked across his right thigh as its head slid off the ski, and it fell back into the sea with a violent splash. Miles tumbled into the water, disoriented. The breath ripped from his lungs. Cold rushed in around him like ice. Blood clouded the water around his leg, and pain bloomed instantly in his thigh, sharp and deep. He flailed instinctively but couldn't tell which way was up. When he broke the surface, gasping, he was only feet from the jet ski, which bobbed low from the damage. Then he saw the shark again, circling slowly beneath the surface, visible in the blue-green haze. It moved with terrifying ease, long tail sweeping side to side, closing the arc. It wasn't in a frenzy. It was curious now, maybe confused, maybe still hunting. Miles tried to swim for the jet ski, but his leg wouldn't cooperate. His thigh burned with every kick. The water tasted of salt and blood. Panic rose fast, almost faster than the pain, and he knew he couldn't outswim what was beneath him. Further inside, the surfers had seen it all. One of them, a local named Jonah, had watched the breach with disbelief. Now he was paddling toward the crash site, yelling, slapping the water to draw the shark's attention. A few others followed, wide-eyed, moving fast despite the risk. Jonah reached Miles first. He looped an arm under Miles's shoulder and pulled him upright. The jet ski was just feet away but drifting, and Miles was barely conscious. His face had gone pale, and blood continued to pulse from the gash in his thigh. Behind them, the shark made another slow pass, its dorsal fin cutting through the surface like a blade. The other surfers circled wide, slapping the water and splashing to keep the predator focused on the noise. Jonah heaved Miles toward the jet ski, struggling to keep his head above water. He kicked with all his strength, heart pounding, terrified the shark would strike again. With one final push, he got Miles close enough to hook an arm over the damaged back seat of the ski. Miles groaned, half conscious, as Jonah scrambled up behind him. Together they rolled his bleeding leg onto the seat, blood dripping over the fiberglass. The shark moved away, then, finally, fading into deeper water. A faint trail of blood followed it, not from a bite, but from the thin lacerations on Miles's leg. The sea calmed again. The violence of the breach had passed, but the mark it left remained. The surfers helped guide the jet ski back toward the beach. It took nearly 20 minutes to get Miles ashore, where paramedics were waiting. His thigh was torn open along the outer muscle, but the damage wasn't as catastrophic as it could have been. The snout impact had bruised several ribs, and the tooth had missed the femoral artery by less than 2 centimeters. Surgery followed that same night. Doctors cleaned the wound, closed it with dozens of stitches, and told him how lucky he was. A few more inches and the shark would have taken his leg, or worse. He stayed in recovery for several days, visited by the surfers who helped him and the local news crews who wanted to hear the story. Marine biologists later reviewed the drone footage and came to a startling conclusion. The shark had breached at the drone's shadow, not because of Miles or the ski, but because the shadow resembled a seal gliding beneath the surface. The shark had likely mistaken it for prey and reacted with instinctive precision. It was one of the first confirmed cases where drone use may have indirectly triggered a shark breach. Experts warned that new tech, especially aerial devices casting strange shadows over water, could confuse apex predators that rely on vision and motion patterns to detect prey. Miles didn't blame the shark. He never had. He had understood it wasn't personal even during the attack, somewhere deep in his mind. The ocean belonged to creatures like that. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, with a tool miming something nature didn't expect. Weeks later, Miles returned to the beach after the stitches came out, and the limp faded. He walked slowly to the surf's edge with his drone packed away, his jet ski still in storage, and a scar running the length of his thigh. He didn't bring a board. He didn't get a camera. He just stood in the water and watched the waves. The ocean didn't care who he was or what he brought with him. It moved like it always had, beautiful, indifferent, and wild. The morning off Praslin Island had been nearly perfect. Clear skies, warm water, and visibility that stretched for meters below the surface. Alain, 33, tall and athletic with a calm, patient presence, had been working as a marine guide in the Seychelles for nearly 8 years. He had led countless snorkeling excursions, guiding guests through coral gardens and fish-rich shallows. This particular outing had gone smoothly. The current was gentle, and the group of 7 tourists, mostly European honeymooners, had followed instructions well. They were just finishing their final swim of the day. The catamaran drifted nearby, anchored in a calm cove. Alain floated a few meters from the group, scanning the water beneath them with the casual alertness of experience. The coral reef below shimmered with darting fish, and everything felt exactly as it should for a few moments, peaceful and predictable. Then, he saw it. A large, slow-moving but deliberate shape emerged from the blue beyond the reef's drop-off. At first, it was just a shadow, broad and gliding, but sunlight revealed the tiger-like stripes running down its side as it turned. A tiger shark at least 4 meters long circled slowly beneath the group. Alain's pulse quickened. He raised one arm calmly, signaling the snorkelers to swim back to the boat. Most didn't understand the urgency, but they followed his gesture. He remained where he was, treading water, watching the shark as it moved closer. His training had taught him that tiger sharks were curious, sometimes bold, but rarely aggressive without cause. Still, he wasn't taking chances. He locked his eyes on the shark, staying between it and the group as they kicked toward the boat's ladder. The shark dipped beneath him, briefly disappearing, then reappeared farther off, circling wide. Alain kept his breathing steady and legs still, hoping the shark would lose interest. But it didn't. Without warning, it surged upward with terrifying speed. One moment it glided, the next it was a blur of muscle and jaws. It struck from below, its snout ramming into Alain's lower back, and then its jaws opened wide and clamped around his torso. The force of the bite knocked the air from his lungs, and blood gushed instantly into the water as the shark twisted its body and dragged him under. The tourists screamed, kicking frantically toward the ladder. One woman dropped her mask and nearly slipped off the steps. The water around Alain turned crimson, and for a moment, he was gone, swallowed by the depths in a flurry of red. The second guide on the boat, Benoit, had been monitoring from the deck. He acted without hesitation when he saw the blood bloom beneath the surface and Alain disappear. He grabbed the long aluminum pole spear kept for emergencies and dove in, slashing through the surface and descending fast. He spotted the shark just below, circling again. Alain floated limply in the water, drifting upward slowly, his torso torn and limp. Benoit swam straight at the predator, jabbing the spear in its direction. The shark flinched but didn't immediately leave. It hovered for a moment, its dark eyes fixed on the motion, then flicked its tail and vanished into deeper water. Benoit reached Alain's body and wrapped an arm around his chest, hauling him up. The sea was thick with blood. The guests had returned to the boat, pale and shaking, several in tears. As Benoit lifted Alain onto the swim platform, the extent of the injuries became clear. The shark's bite had torn through his lower ribs, splitting flesh and bone. His abdomen was mangled. His face was pale, eyes open but unfocused, unmoving. Benoit started chest compressions as the captain radioed for emergency assistance, but it was no use. Alain had been underwater too long. His heart had stopped. His blood loss had been catastrophic. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, Alain's body had already been covered with a towel. Authorities arrived within an hour and began interviewing the shaken guests. The attack had occurred in an area known for occasional shark sightings, but this was different. There had been no baiting, no chumming, no provocation. It was a clear water, broad daylight strike on a human floating in the ocean. Marine biologists investigated and found evidence of fish scraps dumped from fishing boats earlier that morning not far from the reef. While not directly tied to the attack, it raised new concerns. Tiger sharks were opportunistic and had been known to associate certain areas with feeding. Alain was likely in the wrong place at the wrong moment, mistaken for prey in water, where recent feeding may have heightened the shark's aggression. His death marked the second fatal shark attack in that part of the Seychelles in under a year. The local government reacted quickly, closing nearby beaches for a week and suspending all snorkeling and diving tours around Praslin. Tour operators were ordered to reassess their safety protocols, including improved wildlife monitoring, stricter waste disposal regulations, and better emergency training for guides. Alain's death shook the close-knit community of marine workers. He had been respected, known for his steady nature and deep understanding of the sea. Tourists often praised him for making them feel safe in the open water. His final act, staying behind to protect his group, was seen as both heroic and tragic. 2 days later, a memorial was held on the beach. Locals and guests lit candles and placed flowers in the sand. Some threw wreaths into the surf. Others stood silently, staring out at the horizon. The ocean that had taken Alain was still and calm again, as if nothing had happened. But it had. In the days that followed, conversations began to change. Guides spoke more openly about close encounters. Tourists asked harder questions. Safety, once assumed, was now actively reassessed. Alain had trusted the water, known its moods, and respected its risks, but the sea didn't reason. The tiger shark that took him hadn't acted out of malice. It had simply followed instinct. And in a place that looked like paradise, that reminder cut deep. The waters off Stewart Island were cold, dark, and alive with movement, even on a calm day. Hannah had dived in many parts of the world, but respected this place more than most. At 36, she was experienced, careful, and quietly confident. She had logged hundreds of hours underwater, from tropical reefs to murky temperate zones. But this dive was different. It was a drift dive in one of the world's more unpredictable marine environments, where strong currents could push even the most seasoned diver far from the group, and where great whites were more than a distant possibility. She had flown into New Zealand a week earlier to join a small, tightly managed dive tour known for its wildlife encounters. The group consisted of 5 divers and 2 guides, all briefed thoroughly that morning. The goal was to ride a long, slow current through a narrow channel dotted with kelp forests and steep rock faces, a habitat known for seals, rays, and occasionally large predators. The first part of the dive went smoothly. The water was cold enough to numb fingers, but visibility was fair. Hannah floated effortlessly with the current, drifting past thick strands of bull kelp swaying like underwater trees. She kept her breathing slow and her limbs steady, enjoying the weightlessness and silence. Then, without much warning, the current shifted. It tugged harder, sweeping her slightly off to the right, away from the cluster of divers. She kicked gently, adjusting her buoyancy, but didn't panic. She could still see faint shadows through the water, but they were drifting at a different angle now, and she began to lose them behind a curtain of kelp. For a few seconds, she floated alone. That was when she felt it. Something massive surged from the gloom below, a shape so fast and deliberate it seemed to rise out of nowhere. A great white, nearly 4 meters long, had locked onto her movement. Isolated and drifting, she had become a singular object in the current, an anomaly. The shark rose with terrifying power, its white belly catching the filtered light, and before she could even think to react, it bit. Its jaws clamped around her left thigh, crushing wetsuit, muscle, and bone in a single motion. The pressure was overwhelming, a blast of pain so intense it turned into cold shock. The shark shook once, hard, tossing her like a rag doll in the water. Her regulator almost slipped from her mouth. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the shark let go. Blood clouded the water in wide ribbons as the great white turned and vanished into the blue, leaving only silence and pain behind. Hannah was conscious, barely. She looked down and saw her leg torn and streaming dark red, her wetsuit shredded, and bubbles escaping in bursts from her gear. Panic hovered at the edge of her thoughts, but instinct took over. She reached for the inflator on her vest and pressed it. Slowly, her body began to rise. Her vision blurred. She kicked feebly with her good leg, drifting toward the surface, hoping she wouldn't pass out. She had no idea where the others were. She didn't know if the shark would come back. On the surface, one of the guides had just completed a scan of the dive site when he spotted the sudden plume of blood. He raised the alarm, and the boat spun toward the source. A diver was ascending alone. The crew reached her within seconds, pulling her limp body from the water. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy, but she was alive. Blood poured from the torn leg. One of the guides, a trained medic, clamped his hands around the wound and shouted for the tourniquet kit. The others scrambled to stabilize her. She didn't speak, just groaned faintly as they secured her leg and covered her in dry blankets. The bite had torn through most of her thigh, exposing muscle and rupturing veins. Her femur was intact, barely, but she was losing blood fast. They radioed for a helicopter and headed full speed back to the mainland. The airlift team met them near the dock. Paramedics transferred Hannah to a stretcher and began a transfusion en route to a hospital. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body shaking, her mind floating somewhere between fear and numbness. Over the next week, Hannah underwent multiple surgeries. Doctors repaired muscle, sealed arteries, and cleaned the massive wound. Miraculously, no infection set in. With time and careful treatment, the tissue began to heal. Nerve damage was limited, and though her leg would never quite be the same, she would walk again. The incident sent shockwaves through the diving community. Great white sightings near Stewart Island weren't uncommon, but actual attacks were rare. The fact that the shark had struck during a controlled dive and released after a single bite led experts to conclude it had likely mistaken her for a seal or drifting carcass. Her isolated movement in the current made her an easy target. The dive company suspended operations for the season. New safety measures were proposed. More precise diver tracking, mandatory buddy tethers during strong current dives, and stricter protocols for visibility loss. Hannah stayed in New Zealand for her recovery. She spent 6 weeks regaining strength, gradually learning to use her leg again. The pain was sharp at first, but her resolve never broke. She had always respected the ocean, and now that respect had deepened into something more, a recognition that nature remained wild and unsparing even in places of beauty. Months later, she returned to diving in warmer waters near Queensland. It wasn't easy. Her heart pounded harder, her gear felt heavier, and every shadow beneath her made her breath catch. But she kept going. She descended slowly, this time in calm seas, surrounded by others. She didn't drift far. She didn't let her eyes wander. She moved carefully, deliberately, like someone who had learned how thin the line could be. And she found peace in that silent world beneath the waves, not because the fear was gone, but because she had survived it. The waters off Baja California were deceptively calm that morning, the sea painted glassy blue under a rising sun. Lucia had always loved these quiet hours, when the ocean was still, and the only sounds were soft waves lapping against the hull and distant seabirds crying over the horizon. At 31, she was already a respected marine ecologist from Spain, with nearly a decade of fieldwork behind her. She had dived with orcas, tagged manta rays, and swum among whales. But this was different. This was solitude. The research team had anchored near a deep-water buoy, one of several scattered along the migratory corridor used by humpbacks. Their modest but well-equipped vessel was home base for a 2-week expedition that recorded whale song, tracked surface movement, and monitored plankton blooms in the channel's upwellings. Lucia, ever dedicated, rose early that day. She wanted to recalibrate an acoustic sensor tethered to the buoy before the winds picked up. No one else was awake when she lowered herself quietly into the water with mask and fins, towing a waterproof notepad and small toolkit. Her movements were careful, practiced, and confident. The buoy was positioned just above the edge of a submarine canyon that dropped steeply into colder, deeper water, a place rich with prey and known, though rarely spoken of directly, as an occasional hunting ground for large predators. Lucia was aware of the risks. She had read the local briefings, reviewed migration data, and listened to accounts of divers who had seen shadows slipping below them just out of view. Still, the water felt safe in the quiet of early morning. With visibility stretching dozens of meters, she worked beneath the buoy, tightening a loose sensor bracket noting small corrosion patches and marking calibration values. It was simple and routine, and she moved slowly as she adjusted her orientation. She floated just under the surface, the lines from the buoy occasionally brushing against her arm. What she didn't notice was how far she had drifted. The current had gently pulled her away from the shallow shelf and over the canyon lip. The water darkened below her, turning from turquoise to an inkier shade of blue. Somewhere deep in that darkness, a shadow rose. It was a great white female, nearly 4 meters long. It had likely been patrolling the edge of the drop-off, drawn closer by the rhythmic splashing near the buoy. The silhouette of Lucia's body above, combined with the shadow of the floating structure, resembled a distressed animal, perhaps a seal or injured fish. She didn't hear it approach. Only a sudden and sharp scream echoed across the water just once. Her colleagues, still half asleep aboard the nearby vessel, jolted upright. 2 rushed onto the deck and scanned the surface. For a few seconds there was nothing, just empty water and the quiet bobbing of the buoy. Then something red. Lucia's body surfaced near the buoy, floating awkwardly. One fin still on her right foot, arms drifting loosely beside her. Her left leg was gone above the knee, torn away entirely. The left side of her back bore deep, ragged gashes, flesh stripped down to exposed ribs. The team launched the skiff and retrieved her within minutes, but she was already dead. The blood loss had been massive. One of the researchers, shaking, flew a drone to scan the surrounding area. Within seconds, it captured footage of a large shark circling lazily beneath the buoy, its body smooth and pale beneath the surface sheen. The animal was slow now, having already delivered its strike and withdrawn. It showed no fear, no urgency, just silent dominance in its domain. The team reported the incident immediately. Authorities, journalists, and marine biologists from the mainland arrived by helicopter within hours. The footage was reviewed. Based on the bite pattern, footage, and local movement data, the shark was identified as a mature female great white, known to patrol the deeper sections of the trench during peak feeding times. Lucia had not been wearing a shark deterrent, though several were available on board. The device, a simple magnetic field emitter, was standard protocol for deeper excursions, but she had considered her snorkel near the buoy low risk. She had also gone alone, something typically discouraged during offshore work even in familiar waters. The Mexican scientific community was shaken. Lucia was not just another name on a list. She had been a rising figure in marine biology, respected for her field discipline and known for her cautious approach. But even caution had limits. The fact that the attack happened near a monitored buoy raised troubling questions. Did the buoy attract prey that lured the shark closer? Did its shadow confuse the predator into thinking it was an injured animal hiding beneath? Was the water simply too deep for comfort, too close to the hunting ground, too far from the protective rhythms of the surface pods? A week later, her body was flown back to Spain, escorted by 2 colleagues who had worked closely with her on whale tagging projects. A memorial was held at her home institute, where students and mentors spoke about her passion for the sea, her calm under pressure, and her relentless drive to understand the creatures she loved. Back in Baja, the team removed the buoy. Further dives in the canyon zone were indefinitely suspended, and new regulations were drafted mandating paired excursions and mandatory deterrent use during solo tasks, no matter how shallow. The attack did not diminish Lucia's legacy, but altered how others approached the sea. For all her knowledge, she had become part of the very food chain she studied, and that cold truth hung over every diver who later entered those same waters, reminding them that even the most experienced could be mistaken for prey. In time, the ocean grew quiet again. The winds returned, the whales resumed their migrations, and the sharks kept to their patterns. But under the surface, where shadows move without sound, Lucia's story remained, a solemn echo of risk, reverence, and the ever-thin line between study and survival. The rains had pounded Beira for 6 days, turning dry streets into sluggish rivers and soccer fields into lakes. Storm drains overflowed. The Pungwe River burst its banks, and the entire fringe of the city looked like the sea had swallowed it. To the local kids, it was chaos, but also adventure. Samuel was 15, lean and wiry, with a bold streak that often landed him in trouble. Just east of the city's outskirts, his neighborhood sat close to the floodplain. He had grown up watching the annual floods reshape the land, used to seeing water creep past the houses, fill the gullies, and submerge playgrounds. When the soccer field at the end of his street disappeared beneath a foot of water, it became an irresistible swimming hole. The rain had paused that afternoon, though gray clouds still hung overhead. The air was thick and wet, and Samuel and 4 friends waded through knee-deep currents and debris-strewn water to reach the old soccer field. The goalposts were barely visible, their top bars peaking like broken bones. The water was brown and opaque, full of runoff, branches, plastic, and swirling trash. They laughed as they splashed, throwing chunks of soaked grass at each other, diving under the surface, daring one another to swim the full length of the flooded pitch. The current was slow but steady, pulling gently eastward, and no one noticed how far they'd strayed toward the deeper corner, where the old drainage ditch fed into the field. Samuel swam out first, powering through the thick, warm water, enjoying the resistance against his arms. He was a strong swimmer, faster than the rest, always eager to lead. Pulling ahead, he felt something hard brush against his leg, but dismissed it as a submerged branch. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the flood had brought more than garbage. The swollen Pungwe had carried fish inland, pushed them into alleys, flooded yards, and shallow lakes. And following those fish was a bull shark. It had likely prowled the brackish estuary when the flood surge pulled it inland. Unlike most sharks, bull sharks could thrive in salt and fresh water, and during the monsoon season, they sometimes ventured far upriver or into floodplains chasing fish and carrion. The debris-choked water gave perfect cover, and the vibrations of the boys splashing were indistinct but unmistakable, erratic, panicked, like wounded prey. The attack happened in seconds. Samuel had just kicked forward when he felt a sudden, massive jolt. Something slammed into his right side, fast and solid, followed instantly by blinding pain in his upper arm. Before he could cry out, he was yanked beneath the surface, twisting violently as the water around him exploded in bubbles. His friend saw the commotion and froze. The water frothed, then turned red. A panicked scream rose as they saw Samuel reappear, thrashing, his body jerking unnaturally. One of the boys ran into the water, gripping his shoulder and dragging him toward the shallow end, while the others backed away in horror. The water stank of blood and mud. Samuel's right arm was a mess of shredded flesh and exposed bone, muscle torn open along the bicep. His face was pale and contorted in shock, but he was conscious, gasping, eyes wild with fear and pain. The bite had been brutal, but not fatal. Only one pass, the shark hitting high and fast, then vanishing into the murk. They pulled him to dry ground, screaming for help. Adults ran from nearby homes, rushing through ankle-deep water as someone called for aid. A volunteer paramedic team stationed nearby in a flood relief tent responded, arriving within 10 minutes with a stretcher. Samuel was pale, bleeding heavily, and beginning to slip out of awareness. The medic tied a tourniquet just below the shoulder and covered the arm in gauze soaked with antiseptic. He was rushed in a utility truck to a field hospital set up on higher ground near the port. Doctors worked quickly. The bite had exposed muscle and severed tendons, but arteries had been narrowly missed. He received a blood transfusion, underwent emergency surgery to repair damaged tissue, and was kept in a makeshift recovery ward. By the next day, he was stable. The incident spread quickly. Rumors flew about crocodiles or spirits in the water, but local marine biologists arrived to clarify. Based on the shape and angle of the bite, wide, crescent-shaped with deep punctures, they confirmed it had come from a bull shark, likely around 2 meters long. They explained that bull sharks often entered rivers during the wet season, and when extreme floods occurred, the boundaries between river and city blurred. The stagnant pools and floodwaters, full of fish and food waste, became accidental hunting grounds. It wasn't the first time. A fisherman near Chinde had been bitten in a similar flood 2 years earlier, but this attack was different. It had happened in an urban zone where children played, not where professionals worked. The government issued immediate warnings against swimming in floodwaters, and search teams patrolled flood zones in boats, keeping eyes open for further shark movement. Authorities considered erecting temporary fencing near key drainage zones to prevent marine life from entering suburban areas. Though with the flood still rising, there were no guarantees. Samuel stayed in the hospital for over a week. He didn't speak much during the first few days. The trauma lingered, deeper than the wound. He would startle when water dripped from a ceiling or wind slapped tarps around the tents. But slowly, he recovered. Doctors said he would regain arm use, though not full strength. When he returned home, His friends greeted him with nervous smiles and relief. The flooded field was still underwater, but now it was avoided, a silent, muddy reminder that the floodwaters were no playground. Samuel's story was retold by parents, teachers, and aid workers as a warning, the boy who survived the flood shark. A living reminder that the ocean's predators don't always wait offshore, that sometimes they follow the rivers, slip between streets, and strike where no one expects them. And for years afterward, when the rains returned and the water rose, those who remembered stayed away from the field because they knew what had once lurked beneath.